As you come in, feel free to rename yourself and add your affiliation.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
It's nice for people to know, where people are calling from organization-wise. And
Uh,
feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. We have quite a group here today. This is
yeah.
an interesting mashup of a number of different um, types of people and groups of people the CJRF is part of and has created. And I'm really grateful to so many of you for joining us. Um, for those who maybe haven't met me, I'm Heather McRae, and I'm the director of the Climate Justice Resilience Fund. And I want to really welcome you to our latest webinar. We've had a series of these learning webinars to really begin to dig into some of the issues around climate justice that are coming up in our grant making portfolio and really facilitate learning, both for our own grant making, for our own grantees activities and learning and exchange, but then also to synthesize lessons that we can
Okay.
do elsewhere. And today's topic, climate finance, is one where there's a lot of interest. There's a lot of policy conversation globally underway right now. And there's, we think, important lessons to be shared from our portfolio and from our partner community, not only with the philanthropic community that we're a part of and that is represented in part on this webinar, but also with the public finance community, with the World Banks and the climate investment funds and the green climate funds and all of the conversations underway about climate finance as we move into what is likely to be an important United Nations conference on climate this fall. So in that context, we thought we would interrogate this question of finance. And to do that, we have a number of different communities coming together on this webinar. And I encourage, again, all of you to rename yourselves to share your affiliation if you haven't yet, and to turn on your video and wave, and actually be available to wave, because I'm going to call out some of the groups that are represented here. First of all, we have the partners of the Climate Justice Resilience Fund. Many of them have joined us. And so if you're a grantee partner of the Climate Justice Resilience Fund, maybe you can wave, or you can use your Zoom hand to wave. And that, I think everyone kind of likes to know who everyone else is. We also have a special group of people here we call our Council of Advisors, and this is a group that includes some of our grantees, but also includes some outside experts, folks from academia, folks from other funding community areas, from a range of pieces of the climate justice field. And that council has been really a central set of players in helping the CJRF really reflect and distill lessons from our work and explore how to share those effectively externally. So if you're a member of our council, maybe you also can wave so that others can see who's on the council. Our funders and our governing body, our review board, are members of the council, and but they're of course a very special set of players who've been involved in grant approvals. And I see Daria, I see Eve and Julia. I wonder if those who are from our funders can just say hi. Dina and Katerina. Thank you everybody for joining. Then we have a couple of people externally here who've joined today because they're experts in climate finance, or because they're working for funders that are particularly interested in learning about climate finance and are involved in deploying climate finance or advocating around it. I see Liana, I see Athena, I see others. If you want to just wave, folks who are just here for the webinar, essentially. But we're really glad you're here, and thanks very much for accepting our invitation. I hope this gives a little bit of a flavor for who all is here. You're going to get to meet each other in breakout groups before too long, and you're going to get to hear some good stories from across this set of players in just a couple minutes. But the final group that is it's a new group, and it's kind of nascent here, which is a funder collaboration around climate justice and just transition. And this group includes a number of our funders at CJRF, but also some other funders. And Farhana Yamin is coordinating that group. We're really lucky to have her engaging with us and helping us all make sense of these issues and how they're evolving very quickly right now. So Farhana, I wanted to give Farhana a minute to just speak about this collaboration. And again, those who are involved in the collaborative, maybe you can give a wave. I see Hugo over there. I can't see everyone all at once, but Farhana, over to you for a second.
Oh, thank you so much. And it's so lovely to see some familiar faces, those who've been, at the cutting edge of climate finance and making this request and ask for 3 decades now. So my name's Farhana Yamin. I'm going to put my details of this collaborative project in the chat, and there'll be a bit more information there. But just to say in brief, it's wonderful that 6 foundations, including the Climate Justice Resilience Fund as the organizing hub. So thank you, Heather. 6 foundations working with Heather have got together essentially to engaged in learning about how best to support climate justice and just transition work, especially in the global south, but understanding that there are many connections, alliances, networks that crisscross the world. And this is a global agenda that we all need to be part of. And the idea is really that the foundations are going to organize practitioner-led seminars and webinars, a bit like this one, involving not just foundations, but also others who are interested and part of our network. In the end, the ultimate goal of the project is to enhance funding and resources, but also to shift power to those on the front lines and those particularly who've been historically marginalized or whose voice has been underrepresented and not heard. So women, Indigenous peoples, disability, workers, youth, amongst others, the list. And in fact, there's a very good list in Preamble 13 of the Paris Agreement, which mentions climate justice. We'll be working to see, what can frameworks those discussions at COP26 itself. But I'm really, really grateful to Heather and Hilary, and I think they're going to post a little description of the project, my contact details if you would like to be in touch. And if you want to know more about what we might be doing, please get in touch, and hand over back to Heather. And I think we're going to post that in the chat function as well. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Farhana. With that, I'm actually going to hand off to Anna Williams, who is CJRF's Learning Advisor. Anna is on the west coast of North America, so I'm really grateful to her for being up and at 'em very early this morning, getting this webinar going. Anna, will you provide the rest of the orientation and maybe share the answers to our poll?
Hi, yes, thank you and welcome. And it's great to see all of you and to be here with you. I am going to give a brief orientation to the rest of our exchange here today, and then we're going to have 4 panelists join us to share some stories of climate finance and their thoughts on how we can advance climate finance both individually and collectively. I do want to point out that we, sent 2 attachments to the invite to this event, and one is about 10, working in progress key messages for donors that I believe Hilary would be able to send a link to through the chat, or you can refer to the previous messages that you've received. But this is based on an ongoing set of conversations that today's exchange is also part of. On July 8th, we had the exchange with CJRF partners. We had, dozens of active, people working all around the world in different contexts and levels, really exchanging some of their thoughts and experiences on both the challenges surrounding climate finance for justice and resilience and some opportunities that can be acted upon in the next 1, 2, or 3 years. And we're really trying to distill that and advance that in today's discussion as well. So I'd like to just refer you to that, and we'll make sure that you receive it again here today if you don't have it handy. We're going to hear from 4 people momentarily, and I'll introduce them. And we will have about 5 minutes for each of the panelists, and then we will pause for another 20 minutes or so after that to hear your questions and just to have some discussion with the panelists. And I'll encourage you to please ask your questions in the chat or use the chat function in Zoom to raise hands, and we'll make sure that your questions are fielded. Then we'll split into 4 breakout groups, and we're just going to divide the groups based on the panelists' stories, even though what we really would like during the breakouts is for you to also share your stories and your ideas on how to advance finance and overcome some of the bottlenecks and barriers that are so common. And then we'll just come together briefly at the end to do a share out from a few of the partners who've been asked today to do a quick reflection, and ask all of you to please share. We'll be sharing in the chat just due to the time we'll have available. 2 things, and Heather will tee this up, but that will be 1 take-home message today, and 1 idea you might have that you can do to help improve either your work, your organization, or the broader field of finance and donor practices and models. I think with that, I'll just move into the introduction that we have for our 4 panelists, and I'm just going to keep this really brief. And I'm going to introduce them in the order that we have for them sharing their stories today. The first is Nicholas Abuya, who's the Global Program Resilience Advisor for Christian Aid based in Kenya. Louise Oliver, who is the Associate Director of Climate Justice at the Open Society Foundations, I believe based in South Africa. Sheila Patel, who is the chair of the board at Shack Dwellers International, I believe also known by many as Slum Dwellers International. And Arghya Sinha Roy, who I believe is the climate director, or director of the climate program at the Asian Development Bank. And we're very, very happy to have Arghya here today, in order to share, his stories from a multilateral perspective. So with that, I'm going to move into the panel section, and I'd like just to ask everybody to be on mute if you're not on mute unless you're speaking. And we'll start with Nicholas. And Nicholas, I am going to ask you to there you are, excellent. And I will remind everyone that we have about 5 minutes for each of you, and I will be just friendly, trying to remind you if you're running over time. And we'll hold questions until our 4 panelists have shared their stories. So over to you, Nicholas.
Okay, thanks, Anna, and hi everyone once more. My idea is basically to share our experience in Kenya in terms of really addressing the climate change challenges that face vulnerable communities. One critical aspect that we were trying to address is basically how do we make climate finance to flow to vulnerable communities living at risk of climate change. And therefore, way back in 2013, working through a consortium with government agencies, we came up with an innovative model known as devolved climate financing. So the devolved climate financing actually as an approach supports planning and investing in public goods that enhance or support community prioritized adaptation initiatives. The decentralized climate finance mechanism stems from the recognition that climate resilient livelihood can only be built with the incorporation of local knowledge and the recognition of local institutions for resource governance, and of course, in accordance with the priorities and objectives of those who are directly affected. So wherever we worked with the government, we found that actually climate finance hardly trickled down to local communities, and we wanted a system which could really facilitate this climate finance to flow to affected communities in a more predictable manner. And that's how we came up with a decentralized climate finance approach, which is basically anchored on working with the subnational governments in Kenya, known as the county governments. They come up with the legislation which actually recognize the establishment of community institutions to manage climate finance, which is also dedicated through a local law and is actually ring-fenced. So we piloted this initiative in 5 out of 47 counties in Kenya between 2013 and 2017. And for the first time, community institutions known as the World Climate Change Plan Committees, which are constituted by communities, bringing on board various segments of communities, men, women, and even youth, and people living with disabilities, were able really to plan for the adaptation priorities, and they always knew about the budget available to them. And the decision they made in terms of what was supposed to be supported by the subnational government and as the county government could not be vetoed by the technical committee at the county level. And this really brought about empowerment and voice for them to drive the adaptation initiatives. This initiative actually gained momentum, and a number of development partners in Kenya liked it. And later on, we scaled it to other counties outside the arid and semi-arid areas where we piloted it. And presently, as we speak, the government of Kenya, working with other development partners, including the World Bank and other institutional donors like CEDA Sweden and others, are considering supporting it so that it is scaled out to all the 47 counties in Kenya. My critical point I wanted to share here is that actually community institutions, if they are formally recognized and integrated into government planning and the budgeting process, can play a critical role in terms of identification of adaptation priorities, which can be supported through ring-fenced financing coming from the government and the development actors. And this way, we've realized actually very great impact, even in terms of investment. And actually, we have been able to allay the fear that was there that community institutions cannot really measure to the fiduciary standards in terms of financial management. When they are actually supported in terms of capacity building, community institutions, the World Climate Change Plan committees can do a wonderful job. And actually they can be quite accountable and do transparent work, which is actually better aligned to community priorities, including those of women and the different kind of livelihood groups that they support. So I believe that going forward, this is a model which is being considered even in terms of scaling out to other countries, including Tanzania, Mali, Senegal, and even Mozambique, because it is working that actually climate finance can be made to flow directly to affected communities where they play a critical role in terms of procurement of services, even investing on their priorities. What they need is just capacity building and technical support from the relevant technical arms of the government at that level. Thanks.
Thank you, Nicholas. It's really great to hear about your experience and also the scaling, which is ultimately essential, as we all know. We're going to move to our next panelist. Before we ask questions, we'll go through all four, and I do want to encourage you to please ask questions if you have any, or share thoughts on examples or reflections on what the panelists are sharing in the chat. We'll next have Louise Oliver, and looking forward to hearing from you, Louise. Let's see, are you, there you are, excellent. We'll go ahead and hand it over to you, and I'll remind you if it's much more than 5 minutes, but the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thanks, Anna, and hello everyone. And I'm very happy to be speaking on this panel, but I do want to start off by saying it needs to be done with a very healthy dose of humility. The Open Society Foundation's only began its climate justice, climate action work in late 2019, and so our experience and our lessons learned in this space is somewhat limited, but I do think we have some relatively interesting examples to provide. But if you could just bear in mind that there are many of you on this call that have had a lot more experience than we have, and so if consider that in what I'm saying. And I think many of you know the Open Society Foundations. It's a big complex organization that has a large number of staff scattered all over the world. So a substantial head office or head offices, but also substantial footprint in many parts of the global south. And when we embarked upon our climate work, there are various pieces of it. The two pieces I'll speak to in a bit more detail and try and use some illustrations is, of course, our climate finance work, as well as our transnational campaigns work. And when we embarked upon this work, our overriding intention was to ensure that the grants that we made were primarily in the places where people were most impacted by climate. So whereas we certainly didn't exclude, and we have many international groups that work in Latin America, the Caribbean, Sub-Saharan Africa, Asia, our priority was to try and find partners that come from the places, that are staffed from the places where people are most impacted by climate. There are, of course, two pieces to our strategy in terms of both looking at mitigation and resilience and adaptation, and the climate finance piece is infused through both of those, through both the mitigation as well as the resilience and adaptation piece of our work. Something that became very obvious to us very quickly, those of us who are working on the climate finance team, was that the majority of players working on climate finance were not based in the global south, were mostly think tanks or sort of high level civil society groups that were based either in Western Europe or the United States. This was a scanning of the field that we did, and not exclusively, but primarily. So when looking at an energy transition group that had a particular focus on climate finance as with Just Transition, we found 3 organizations, one in East Africa, one in Southern Africa, one in West Africa. We could find 5 substantial groups based in the UK that would meet the criteria. And it's a lot easier to fund your more established organizations rather than those that are perhaps less known. And so in our first year, almost 90% of our climate finance grants. And why do I say it's much easier? It's easier to initiate the conversations. It's easier to get a quick proposal. It's easier to see how their work aligns and with our strategy. It's there are various things that make it easier. And I think it's incumbent upon us to have done more work to ensure that our funding in the climate finance space was spread more broadly. And when we looked at our portfolio, 90% had gone to, well, around about 90% had gone to organizations, actually, just to be quite honest, in the UK and the US, with the exception of very few in the global south. And just to give you a sense, our budget, we spent around about 44 million US dollars last year. Not all of it on climate finance, but a decent enough piece on climate finance. So what we did was we adapted our strategy somewhat, and we decided to make it an overt intrinsic piece of our work to say that we would identify where there are gaps and where Global South organizations needed particular support. In some instances, it was capacity. Some instances, it was ability to network. In some instances, it was to look beyond a country or a region. So we found an amazing group in Kenya, and I'm sure Nicholas would know them, and they do work beyond the borders of Kenya, but they're known primarily for their Kenyan work. So how would we be able to assist them to be known for more than just the work that they do in Kenya on climate finance and energy transition and just transition? So we made it an overt piece of our strategy where we would actually ring fence a particular budget where we would only spend that on this particular area. And you can see our grants this year reflect that. And so it needed to be a distinct piece of work where, rather than saying, oh, that, you know, we have this overall objective to try and fund in the global south, but the reality was that wasn't happening. So we ring-fenced an amount and said that would only go to the global south, which has not made it 50-50 yet. And we'd ideally like it to be sort of 60-40. It's still less than 50, but it's much better than 10% that what it was. And I have been asked to give some kind of discrete examples of what we learned in some of our funding relationships. And I want to speak about two places very quickly. Our work in Jamaica and our work in South Africa. And in both, so the Jamaican piece of work was climate finance vis-a-vis resilience and adaptation. Our South African piece of work was energy transition from coal to renewables. The climate piece was attached to that. And in both instances, three key things were essential in finding the right partners and making sure that grants were being made, not just to the think tanks and the universities, but also to the grassroots organizations, defenders and activists. And I speak from a position of some privilege because we do have staff in both of those places. And having staff in those places was absolutely critical in being able to identify all the different players. These are staff that are based in those countries, that have worked for many years in those countries, not necessarily in climate, but certainly, you know, you in a national pool, you get to know the field pretty well. And that's not a luxury that's afforded to every donor. So what happens when you don't have that ability to have staff on the ground that can identify that right set of players that you're looking for? I think working with other donors is essential, and I'm part of the human rights donors group that a number of you are, Oak Foundation, Wallace, Wellspring, a number of us are part of this. And I think speaking to donors that have that access and hearing from their suggestions is hugely useful as well. And certainly a lot of the work that we stood up in this donor collaboration, which is a loose collaboration, has been, exclusively to Global South players, but not in the finance, not working on finance. Not working on finance. And then the third thing is there are a number of networks out there as well, and they're not necessarily climate networks. So I think of something like ESCRnet, which many of you may know, have membership across the globe, but primarily in Global South countries. We managed to identify some critical players through those type of networks. Climate Action Network was another example through their regional and national hubs, and 350.org was hugely helpful. The Klima Fund, and I think there's someone from the Klima Fund on this call, was also very useful. Final 2 points that I want to make is that for grassroots groups, for activists and defenders, often climate finance is not part of their work. To just say that, it's of course it's not true in every instance. There are certainly exceptions, and it's getting better and better. And I think being able to invest in an organization in both Jamaica and in South Africa, where there was potential, but it wasn't quite at the point where it was really important. And it's a work in progress, but we invested in that development component because it wasn't there. And then finally, just one comment on regranters, and it's something that I've seen in the climate finance space quite a lot, is that there'll be an institute that's set up in the Global South in a region. So let's talk about Africa. Sub-Saharan Institute will be set up, and a number of big donors will want to use them as the regranters in the climate finance space. And absolutely, I mean, much better having that happen than not having money go down to the ground. But I don't think that a regranter, which is perhaps it has the same level of insight and expertise as on the ground in country perspectives that some donors have, that organizations that we work with and fund, and in some international groups that have memberships from those countries have. So I don't think it's a replacement. I think it's an excellent supplement, but not necessarily a replacement. Thanks.
Thank you, Louise. And you shared a lot of great insight, and I know it's also such a vast topic and deep that it's hard to even try to do something like this in 5 minutes. So thank you for those who are adding in some questions and reflections to our panelists, and we have 2 more. I'm going to ask Sheila to please go next and share some experience from your perspective working with Shack Dwellers International. And again, I'll just remind people to please attempt to be on the 5-minute mark, and I'll just do a friendly reminder if need be. So Sheila, we're so grateful to have you today, and over to you. If I don't see you, I don't know if you're on mute. Where did you go? Sheila, are you there?
Yeah, I'm on mute. Okay.
There you are. Okay, thank you.
So I had said, I thought I had sent you a PowerPoint. Did you get that? No, I think I sent it to Hillary, but I'll just use mine for my own reference. So just to correct one thing about what you said to me, I'm the past chair of SDI. I've handed this over to Joseph Maturi, who's a community leader from Kenya, who's taken my place. So just quickly to introduce myself, my name is Sheila Patel. I'm a grassroots activist. I've worked for the last 35, 40 years on issues of urban poverty. And I have in India a network of an alliance of grassroots communities and ourselves as SPARC, who form the Indian Alliance, on the basis of which Shack Dwellers International has developed this global transnational network, which has 33 countries and similar partnerships of a small NGO and many community city federations. So maybe you can go to the next slide. Thank you. From the beginning, our work has been to address the issues of eviction, marginalization, invisibility of the urban poor. And we were set up in 1996 formally, and gradually found that those communities that were able to fight and resist evictions now needed to address very fundamental issues of basic amenities and services. And that required some experimentation, which required capital grants. SDI's main function initially was just to provide resources for communities to form federations, to have them women-centered through the women's savings groups, to explore and support the exchanges of ways by which different people were learning different things, and to mainstream our toolbox, which was women's savings groups that produced the women's collective leadership that formed the basis of our organization, our evidence gathering through data collection of all informal institutional arrangements that we were part of, and to support peer learnings to share what we could do and what we had learned. Over a period of time through this learning, people wanted to experiment, and we saw that we required large grants. And gradually right from 1996 to around 2006, these small grants were given from the core funds that we got. When we aggregated that data, we realized that there were amazing innovations that came out of what we call precedent setting, and that we needed to have a fund that provided capital grants for communities to demonstrate what innovation and change they needed. And for all of you in the climate space, we were not in the climate space till 3 years ago. And so what we realized is that we've called this the Urban Poor Fund and invited our grant makers, who were mainly, until then, maybe philanthropies, to give us money in which there was a segment for capital funds. Next. Can I have the next slide, please? So out of the 33 countries, 14 of them got funds and 11 of them have participated in a research that we have done to gather information and analysis and insight development of the transition that we wish to make to convert this kind of funding that we want to come from the climate space. And of these 11 countries, as you can see, they've been getting money from different times. Some have got more, some of them have got less, but out of the 14 countries that got the money, 11 were part of the study. Next. What we did was that in the financial support that was provided, we found that we needed to provide grants for sustaining these large federations of the urban poor. We work in almost 500 cities and in these 33 countries. We realized that we needed to have ways by which we could make communities then look at how they'd like to revolve the money that they got from the capital funds. Some could do the full lot, some could do half, some could do quarter, but it was up to them, and it produced their capacity at the national level, not only to design and execute projects, but to also revolve whatever resources they got. Next. What we also did, just go through all that. This just gives you the pathways that we had. And therefore, in the 10 years that we had a total of $57.8 million that was distributed. And these capital grants, most of it was in the form of grants to maintain the process. And some of it went into this, but it was very community driven. It belonged to people, those who designed it, estimated it. But the serious work that STI did was it completely shared the risks that went with giving poor people such capital. Because poor people face immeasurable risks in the partnerships through which this is produced. And the refrain that all of you who may be giving money would be, oh, we've given you money, but you've not spent it. Or that you spent it and nothing's come out of it. And those are the risks that poor people have to take when they venture into doing something that is new and different. And we ensured that the revolving fund was in local currency. Next. So here's the numbers of the past. You just look through it. And what we're saying is that the 57 million that we had, which was the fact that we almost leveraged 60% more money from communities, from other donor agencies that the people were able to get money from, and mainly from existing government subsidies whose entitlement was there for communities, but they were never able to access it because that subsidy went trickling somewhere else. So our vision is that we now want a fund of 500 million for 33 countries over the next 5 years based on this strategy. Now, I won't go by all the rest of the things. I'll use the rest of the time to address some of the issues that I feel are important for grant makers to do. We've realized that in the beginning, everybody requires very risk-friendly, small amounts of money to learn how to do this work and have the right to fail. Donors hate to think about failure, and I think you must embrace failures because they teach you all the impediments that come in the way of poor people managing money. The second thing we realized is we don't have to change anything that we do. We just have to look at every need that poor people have from a climate perspective, because the climate perspective is there in every development investment that is needed for poor people. Poor people can define it. Women can actually participate in the design. We also see that our scaling model is different from others. We look at millions of small projects across all these countries, mimicked by others like ourselves, to be the model that social movements have to take on. And I urge all of you to keep in your repertoire of organizations a social movement who will embrace risks, tell you the challenges that are there, and won't sweet talk you into telling you that, you know, these terrible things happen, so we couldn't do it. Talk about real political and other issues that come in the way. And finally, we have been able to influence many others, because already giving money to the urban poor is almost not there for capital projects. But we find that gradually we are beginning to impact others. And DFID, when it wasn't FCDO, had begun a program called CLIF, which was designed on the basis of our Urban Poor Fund to help provide money for the next level of financing that was needed. And so what we believe in is that ultimately sustainable finance will come out of local resources. Global institutions can't perpetually give money to do projects, but you can contribute to introducing us to new technology, to new systems of managing projects, and to collaborate with us to ensure that the spend reaches where it does. So just go, I think there's one more slide in which we've talked about what, so these are the, mainly we spent money on housing and sanitation, and we just begun to work on disaster relief and energy. Next. And this is what is important. We've reached out directly to 155,700 households with projects like this. And all our organizations have set up local revolving funds from which they borrow and replace. This money depletes, but it produces assets which are 10 times worth the investment that have been made. We haven't done that calculation yet, but we will. So we want to be in conversation with donors to say, keep a social movement of whichever kind that is in your portfolio of issues that you care about, because social movements have the appetite and the capacity to experiment and take risks that smaller organizations cannot do, because they cannot absorb these kinds of risks. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Sheila. Again, such a wealth of wisdom and experience. And I really am enjoying how all three of the panelists thus far have a similar and also complementary themes. And without further ado, I will pass over to Argo Singha Roy with the Asian Development Bank. And Argo, I think you also have a few slides. We don't have that much time left for this session, so I will ask you please to try to keep it short so we leave a few minutes for questions in this panel, in this plenary group for panelists before we break into the breakout group discussions. So Argo, over to you.
Thank you, Anna. I hope you can hear me
Yes, we can.
and see my slide. I just have one slide actually. So thanks everybody, and very nice to meet you all. And hi Sheila, this was a great presentation from your side. I work for a financial institution, a multilateral development bank. So my presentation is of course is within the boundaries of what a bank typically does in this case. So I wanted to share a story, or rather a journey, explaining an example of a country which tried to do some of the principles of local adaptation through a national government-driven program. So I'm talking about a country in Southeast Asia region, which is an LDC, very high risk. In the recent years has faced extreme weather events like tropical cyclones and flash floods, which has made the government recognize the importance of investing ex ante in resilience building, and specifically at the local level. The country also has a very diverse hazardscape, with a long coastal area, a big dry zone, as well as in the mountainous and hilly region, which also means that no one resilience solution can be implemented across the country. So in this context, the government was keen to do a large-scale program focusing on local level resilience building. But what we recognize is, while the government has appetite for such a program, there is no specific government policy in place which gives dedicated attention to community-led resilience work. And without a dedicated policy in place, while one can fund a program, the sustainability of the program becomes a bit difficult, because the government's own budget is not necessarily always geared towards continuing such program. So the first task of ours was to work with government in partnership with civil society organization, national research organizations and academia for over a 1.5-year period to develop a national framework for community resilience, which recognized that while resilience building has to happen at all levels, a large section of resilience amount has to go down to the local level, so that communities can prioritize their needs based on consultation with local governments. So the first hurdle was partly solved. But then once we had the policy in place and we were about to develop the program, I'm talking about a really large scale program of a few $100 million, then the idea was, even if you want a community-led program, there is no government mechanism in place to get the money to the local level. The public financial management system of the government doesn't allow that to happen. And when you're talking about that bigger sum of amount of money, you need to have the fiduciary standards in place in order to ensure that money is reaching down for the purpose it's meant for. So then we looked around and we identified another national government program in the context of rural development, which has been using a community-driven development model where block grants are given to community-based organizations, and they prioritize how they would like to spend the block grant, primarily for community infrastructure purposes. So we thought we can use the same model because it has existing community groups already in place who have the capacity, have undergone training, etc. And we can use the same model, but change the design from a resilience context. Now there comes the issue that these community-driven development programs typically only fund community infrastructure, which the community members prioritize. But from a resilience perspective, the communities wanted not just infrastructure solutions, but equally solutions for livelihoods, as well as ecosystem-based management, which often cuts across communities and often beyond district boundaries. So then we had to find a more multi-layered solutions where we split the program into two parts, where one important part remained as community infrastructure, but the other part we introduced a revolving fund, as Sheila was saying, led by the women's group, looking at livelihood solutions. However, the third part, which we really wanted, was to pick up this issue on nature-based solutions or ecosystem-based solutions. But the issue was that had to be done at a landscape level, which is often beyond the village, across a district, etc., to really make an impact. And the legislation in the country doesn't allow in districts to come together and commingle resources. As a result, we couldn't do an ecosystem-based measure at the landscape level. We see only limited our interventions to community and household level. And lastly, we wanted to make sure that while this is a program of 7 years or 8 years of implementation, which is good, but we didn't want the program to end just as a program. So the effort was from the very beginning, how can the program influence local governments, local development funds, so that over time, the local development fund can also adapt this bottom-up planning and prioritization processes involving communities, and for them to then prioritize what solutions are required for resilience building in the long run. So essentially, I'm talking about a 10-year horizon where you spend a couple of years doing the planning processes, identifying the mechanisms of how money can flow and have the right capacity at the local level, and then over 7 to 8 years of implementation time to really make any difference. Now, for me, the key learning is, in this case, in our case, the money is not the issue, but the issue is to have the right systems in place so that the policy environment is available, the institutional architecture is in place, and most importantly, the money also accompanies strengthening capacity of local institutions to work with local communities and in partnership or collectively identify solutions that really makes the best solutions according to the local risk landscape. So for me, it's beyond the issue of the dollar figure of climate finance, but the larger environment needed for climate finance to be sustainable. So I'll stop over here and hand back over to you, Anna. Thank you.
Thank you, Argo. And it's also just excellent to hear an example of a national government investment that then was able to figure out how to really support locally led adaptation, and making that connection at all levels is something that I think everyone is focused on, like how to do that. I do want to ask, pass on one question that was in the chat to Nicholas before we break out into the breakout rooms and discussions. And I think that this question will actually apply to all panelists and to everyone participating in this today. And that for you, Nicholas, is, can you name a challenge that has come up in the model that you described, and how you or others at Christian Aid may have overcome that challenge? The challenges still are so many in this area that it's great to hear an example from you, if you can share one of challenge faced and what you've done about it.
Challenges were many, but one critical challenge, and I think the last panelist has kind of alluded to it, is that one that relates to policy and enabling environment. So for example, in Kenya, when we were urging the government to set aside a dedicated ring-fenced climate finance for communities, one critical aspect was how do we channel public funds to community institutions which are not recognized formally as government institutions? How do we account for those funds? That was a big thing for the subnational government here known as county government. So we had to navigate around that in terms of supporting the county government to put in place a legislation aligned to the Public Finance Management Act that recognizes community institutions known as the Ward Climate Change Planning Committees as entities for purposes of planning and budgeting on matters climate change. So when the legislation was put in place, that hurdle was overcome. Therefore, the funds could be channeled to them and they could account back. And of course, that piece of law supported the uses of fund and making it flow to the communities. That's just one example, but the challenges were many.
Thank you, Nicholas. And that echoes not only the the need and the follow through on local accountability and community organization accountability, but as Sheila has mentioned, the sharing of risks across the entire group of actors involved in finance. You know, I think it's time for us to go to the breakout groups. Otherwise, I would be very tempted to continue with the questions that people have been sharing and thinking of. But let's do that in the breakouts. And what you'll do.
Welcome back, everyone. I hope you had some rich discussions. I got to move in and out of a set of breakout groups.
Time is never enough.
Sheila, what were you saying? What were you saying that last sentence?
No, so I said that one of the things that we are committing to as STI is we're ready to sit with anybody who has an appetite for a serious, good shouting match. We're there. No holds barred.
Well, what we thought we would try, and actually this was Sheila's suggestion, is a chat waterfall as our report out from these breakout groups. You've had rapporteurs and they've been gathering some messages in a Google Doc. But what we'd like to do now is have everyone report out. And the way we're going to do this is for everyone to take a minute to just draft one line. Don't send it, don't put it in the chat yet, but just draft that one line. And then we're going to all send it together as the waterfall into the chat. One line of your major takeaway, whatever is at top of mind for you from your breakout discussion. All right.
I'm learning so many new words.
Yeah, okay, are you ready? I'm gonna do a countdown. 3, 2, 1, send. Here they come, all the chats, all the key takeaways. I'm gonna ask a couple of you just to share orally what you had as your main takeaway. I wonder, Helen, would you be willing just to share yours?
Yeah, mine is more than one-liner, so I'm not sure if we have time for that. Yeah, for local communities, women and indigenous peoples, existing funds are few, far apart, short-term, not scalable, few and project-based. I mean, because in the breakout group, we were talking about impacts and how to define impact. So my key takeaway is that there's a need to shift paradigms and also change narratives of when we talk about scale and impacts. Who defines scale? Usually when we talk about scale and measurement, we refer to number of people, amount of tons of CO2 equivalent, or how large the geographical coverage of climate action. But we should redefine scale to look deeper rather than wider, to include, for example, policy and attitude changes, smaller, locally driven and proven climate actions that can be scaled up, replicated, and strengthened. Thank you, and over.
Thank you so much, Helen. How was that, the chat waterfall? Did you like trying that? Do you want to try it again? This time not just takeaways, right? This time is about actions. Just take 1 minute and think about one action you want to take based on what you've learned in this webinar. It can be something really small, but you know, an email you're going to send, you know, a note you need to make to yourself, a link you want to share with someone, a follow-up conversation with someone you met here, or maybe something bigger. Maybe you've had a big eureka. Take a minute and get ready to share that in our second chat waterfall. Just take a minute and draft your one-liner. going to do it again. This is our countdown to actions. 3, 2, 1, send. Here they come. Here come the actions people have noted. Let's check in again verbally with a couple of people here. Hugo, would you be willing to share either your action or your takeaway? And again, we're down to 5 minutes here, so we really need it to be pretty concise.
Sure, I'll be concise. International funds such as the Green Climate Fund are notoriously bad at reaching communities. And what made me really hopeful is that today I learned a lot about creating frameworks to improve this, to actually make sure that that communities working on local levels actually do receive the funding they need to create the impact that they need. And so my action would be to support support networks and platforms and organizations who do work on local level to connect better to international climate finance.
Thank you. Thank you. Salote, would you be kind of our last reflection here, sharing either your takeaway or your proposed action?
Sure. My key takeaway is there's many. The key one is the philanthropic community are still very much learning and actively looking for solutions to fund local solutions more effectively, including assessing their internal processes, such as thinking differently about what funders mean about how they measure impact, their grant-making policies, which are also some of the barriers that community partners are facing in building trusting relationships. So we have a lot of work to do.
Yes, a lot of work to do. Thank you, Salote. We have so much rich material from this webinar. We have notes from breakout groups. We have recordings of our panelists. Now we have our chat waterfalls of your takeaways and actions. And our next steps really as CJRF are to synthesize all of this. And we're very fortunate. We have a group of our partners who've been the planning group for this event. And this is a group I forgot to introduce at the very beginning. It's Sheila and Gargi, and I think Tracy, you were on that group. Could the members of that group just kind of give a wave so everyone knows? We're going to pull this group together and ask them to help us synthesize all of the rich material here. As you saw, there's a couple of documents we've created, and there's sort of living documents right now around main messages from the CJRF's work on climate finance. This next several months are an important one for delivering those, not only to philanthropy, but into the global climate policy discourse and the public finance spaces. And then also just a summary of the work we've supported that's relevant to climate finance and may hold lessons for others who are grappling with these challenges. So, so we're in a process of refining that. Our planning group will be coming back together to pull things together and synthesize. And for those of you who didn't get enough time in your breakout groups, another next step is we have left a 30-minute block of just open discussion. This is completely optional for those who are exhausted with Zoom. We totally understand you have a lot of other things to do, but those who want to continue the conversation in an open space for the next 30 minutes, we do have that space available this time. But for those of you who aren't going to stay with us, I want to say goodbye. Everyone, please turn your cameras back on and just, unmute yourselves, say goodbye, say thank you to all of our wonderful panelists, to our planners, to our council members, our facilitators and note takers. It's really been a very rich event, and thank you again, all of you, for attending and joining. And I am going to turn off my video for just a second, but I'll be back for our 30-minute chat, and hoping some of you can stay.
Heather. Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.
That's great. Thanks.
Take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
And we'll just give Heather a break there for a moment. Yeah. It's great to see some of you are hello, everybody. I think we've all met, and I think it's great to see you. One of the things I was really struck by was how even leading organizations, including many on this call, are still really struggling, I think, to enact some of the best practices or things that were shared today, and how to support donors and to really make some of those transitions. So I don't know if others were struck by that, but for instance, finding the right people to fund in a more local or community based modality, how to do that, how to ensure the fiduciary responsibilities are being handled, so many different things. But I'm just curious if others have additional examples or ways to help support finance institutions and their leadership to make these changes.
And I have a kind of a real burning moral question in all of this that really gets me and keeps me up at night, is that, at least speaking to philanthropy, not to bilaterals or financial institutions, but to philanthropy, isn't their mission to make themselves redundant? Isn't their mission to solve the world's problems with their money? And if that's their goal, then there has to be an active transition process, so that the money is basically redistributed. I mean, that's what we're kind of talking about as a fundamental. One of the things I wanted to tell you, and it's good we're on this group, is I appreciated the 10 guidelines or recommendations. And it reminded me of a conversation I had yesterday with someone from the localization team at Save the Children, which was relative to the locally led adaptation principles. And her feedback was that they're not specific enough. So I would challenge all of us to go back to those 10 recommendations for donors and maybe flesh that out with some real examples of steps that they can take for their transformation. Because I think philosophically, a lot of them will buy in, to the general messaging. But those of us in the field here, and many, many more experienced and resourced people than myself, have a lot more to bring to this conversation. But we are going to have to explain to them how to do it, because they need to know step by step. Sheila's presentation was a great example of that, and some of the other presentations as well.
One of the things we are going to do is we're going to look at these 8 adaptation financing principles and identify the things we need to do, intermediary institutions need to do, and the primary providers of assistance have to do, be they state, non-state actors. I don't know whether we'll have all the tenacity we need to do everything, but Suranjana and I are doing that, and then we're looking at the way by which how that financing links to the Sendai framework, because that's the one that affects us and integrates many of our concerns more than the other things. So when we do that, we'll let you know if we survive doing that.
I'm wondering whether as part, sorry, butting in, but I'm wondering whether as part of your discussion, folks have actually thought about, kind of obligations or responsibilities of those of the funders that work as intermediaries.
Yeah.
In the sense of, that you codified or wrote down principles of how they should act, what they should take on, for example, because I think one of the big issues, which I think came through in the discourses as well, is that, there is really not that much of a loosening of the discourses about fiduciary principles, reporting requirements. And then again, I mean, I think even in some of the breakout, basically the responsibilities that a lot of the funders feel they have to those that do oversight them, or where they get their money from, if it's, government organizations and so on. So, I mean, a lot of the discourse is always, we are accountable to the taxpayer, and we have to, we have to account for how the money is spent, and we need to make sure that it's good practice and so on and so forth. And this is obviously as a narrative and as a practice has served very well and continues to serve very well to keep a lot of groups and folks out. So, I mean, my interest was always in trying to feel what does that mean then as responsibility for those that have the capacity, either institutional or otherwise, to do the reporting, to do the fiduciary accounting and so on and so forth, towards those that cannot access and might not have the capacity. So for me, the intermediation would not just be the financial part, but a lot of taking on all of those other requirements as well. And again, I think, you know, to the extent that a lot of the organizations that are in the funding space are doing some sort of that financial, well, funding intermediation, that for me would need to be a whole package deal again, and not just channeling money on, but actually taking on a lot of the other responsibilities as well. I'm just curious, you know, I haven't been privy of some of your discussions to know whether that has come up and to what extent that has come up.
It comes up a lot for us at the CJRF, Liana, of thinking about whether we can, you know, reduce reporting burden from our grantees, and it's taken 4 years, but we have figured out some ways to like simplify the budget template, for example, and put that administrative burden on us rather than on the applicant. And even so, it's not perfect. There's still stuff only the applicant can do, but it becomes, it's very granular and pretty boring, right? And we've revised our reporting framework 3 times in 4 years of our, not like the narrative reporting, right? And what do we expect to see from our partners, and our evaluators and those kinds of experts, they're so annoyed with us because we, like, it gets slimmer and slimmer, and it's a little risky for us. But we find that these kinds of events and conversations with our grantees are the best way to know what our grantees are up to. But you ask any expert and we're just not getting enough information from them. and there's maybe some risks for us in that at some point. We'll have to see.
You know, if you put all these accountability things in a nice narrow box, communities are screwed. I think it's important to look at the larger political landscape of fund transfers and the fact that 90% of aid is for trade. Let's not play games with cute little money that we get. Yeah. All these organizations, bilateral and multilateral, that give all this grief to us are doing really bad things. And we are so stupid and we are not aware of those things. And God help anybody who asks me. I now sit and read every single trade and gossip about large businesses. So nobody can sit and give me these sermons. And I think that's also part of our duty and obligations, because it's like what one of you said in this earlier discussions, that people are giving money in millions to people who are in, who are doing new software for development, and then they fail, and then they have some cute reasons why they fail, and they get more money. So I have a friend who is in development and works in a business school. He says development and the software industry are opposite. Everybody in the software industry wears badges of failure, and they get more money and they get more money, and you get screwed. So I think we also have to look at all these things and not be bothered and talk about monitoring and evaluation. I find that we have to have serious conversations with people who do evaluations and understand the frameworks that they use. They are very colonial references. Nobody talks. I mean, today, for instance, for me, this in climate finance, IID's work on where money matters was seminal. I mean, organizations, the procurement of all these big organizations allowed only these big companies who knew nothing about development to manage these monies. They took 35% of the funds to do that because they were so-called covering risks. And they haven't spent any money. But nobody's checking why the money didn't get spent. And everybody says, no, but the framework doesn't allow. So it's like, you know, when you study, when you are an educationist, you say if your results are not in a bell curve, something's wrong with your system. Why can't we use the same logic? If you can't spend the money, something's wrong with your system. So I'm just saying that I'm learning these things as a means to challenge the oppression that all of us feel on the ground. And you know, I've learned so much from the community women who say that if you're poor, you cannot make mistakes. If you're a researcher, you can say, I don't have enough evidence to make something definitive. And you can get hundreds and hundreds and thousands of dollars. And I do some little pick sweep, some calculation mistake, and I get thrashed. And I'm told, why aren't there some good outputs and impacts? You know, it's like somebody said, in 6 months, the world hasn't been able to solve problems of water and sanitation for 5 decades. And I get a 2-year grant in which I have to solve everything. So I think we need to do that. I'm sorry for this, but it's bothering me.
I want to echo what you're saying and also assure you that although it may be a minority of organizations and program staff and also evaluators, there is a really strong and growing recognition that these kinds of transformational changes take time and learning by doing. And you have to embrace innovation, embrace failure, embrace the learning that comes from trying things and not getting it right the first time or the second time or the third time. And really that is the key to empowering systems change and ultimately the transformational change we're seeking. So I don't want to go on for too long, but especially in the context of climate, and then you add COVID, there is not only an awareness, but a commitment to longer term support and change that isn't going to expect such linearity and, you know, Western or whatever donor driven results on a red, green, yellow type of framework. It's too little, too late, and not fast enough. But you know, you're echoing, I think, a growing movement. And thank you for doing it. We all have to amplify and echo it as much as we can.
I just saw Eve put in the chat a link to, I guess it was a webinar, Eve, about
Global Engagement Lab. They have a really great webinar series going on. It's the 3rd and final session next week on walking the walk, trust relationships and breaking power dynamics. And I intended this week's one on funding justice and equity. And a lot of what we talked about today and what you raised, Sheila, and what others raised in their presentations was talked about there as well. And that's another group of funders and grassroots organizers, and they had simultaneous interpretation in Portuguese and Spanish. So, I mean, I think it also reaches really different people. And it's a very, very nice group. I can thoroughly recommend next week's session. And I just wanted to respond to Liana's, this thing about accountability, and it's the taxpayers' money, and we have all sorts of requirements, and it's quite, you sort of get comfortable, or you sort of think this is the way it is, this is the framework. And we've recently, as an organization, slowly been trying to respond to these, I mean, still too slowly, as you say, Anna, but trying to respond to this more long-term, more flexible. And it's really interesting to see what is possible. And it's actually possible, and we can do it. And a lot of us is actually, it's us. It's in our heads on we can't do this, but we never actually asked. We never actually asked how flexible can we get, and do we actually need this? In some cases, maybe we asked 20 years ago or 10 years ago, and in the meantime, things have changed. and also about reporting requirements. I mean, some things are still necessary, but in some cases, we can also decide ourselves to take on that risk. And if something happens, then it's us as a foundation that will have to take the rap, but not our grantees. And I was surprised. I mean, I've only been with the foundation for less than 4 years, but I was surprised at how fast you can think we can't do this. And then it actually turns out you can. A lot more is possible than I thought. So we're trying.
Carlos just joined us. Thank you for joining, Carlos. I know you're here just for the coffee chat, it turns out, but this is, you know, it's a coffee chat. It'll be fun.
Hey, extreme apologies. I had a medical appointment early, and so I'm so sorry I missed out on all the great conversation. But I'm happy to hear what the take up, particularly Sheila's comments about monitoring and evaluation, which hit many buttons for me, both good and bad. So happy to talk about any of that. And I should note that I'm actually leaving my current position in less than 3 weeks at the Urban Institute, and I'll be at Brookings for 2 years and then going up to Harvard. And so, but I will continue to have a commitment to the Climate Justice Resilience Fund. In fact, it'll be a bigger commitment because at Brookings, I can just think big thoughts and work for free for CJRF.
Welcome. We're delighted to have more of your time and see you in a new role there.
May I ask, are you seeing any movement amongst funders to actually rethink the reporting process from the ground up? In other words, really taking communities into consultation and starting to imagine another way, another system, not only of monitoring and evaluation, but actually fiduciary accountability, because I think we're still saddled with a colonialized global north-centered system overall. And I agree with Liana's points that governments, this is not changing anytime soon. But I wonder, particularly among the progressive funders, if there's a way to sort of carve out a new way of doing this in consultation with your global South partners and contacts and networks.
I mean, you know, the link that Eve shared, I think is part of a bit of a movement right now, and I think it got some wind in its sails, oddly, from COVID, and maybe even more so from the racial justice protests last year in the US. There's a lot of discussion right now around philanthropy rethinking its model and what it is that we are really up to, and how can power really shift when there's such concentration of wealth. It really flies in the face of a power shift to have philanthropy in some respects. So you see interesting approaches to this. For example, none of our colleagues from the Candida Fund are here, but they are a spend down foundation where they are deconcentrating that pile of money. They're spending it all out, and they won't exist as a foundation next year, I think. No, 2023. They're very close to gone, and they're planning that out, and they're making it happen, and that is, you know, a distribution of that money, and a pretty clear decision not to concentrate wealth across the generations in that foundation. That's one way to approach it. You know, others are like the kind of grant making where there's very few strings attached, where it's a big grant. It doesn't really have a time frame. It doesn't have doesn't have much of a expectation around particular activities or outcomes. It's a decision that we want this money to be with this group, and we're gonna let go of it from there. There's different flavors and levels of letting go. I haven't scratched under the surface of, say, the big grants that came from Mackenzie Scott, Jeff Bezos's ex-wife, a few weeks ago. Actually, two of CJRF's grant partners received some of those and received some of that money. But you know, on the surface, it looks very flexible. And it looks big. It's, you know, millions of dollars in a single grant. So that's another way to think about the power shift. Others are, you know, like Sheila was describing, get social movement representatives on the board of a foundation, change how the decisions get made. And there's lots of models for changing how the grant decisions get made. Our friends at the Frida Fund, who I think at least someone from Frida was on the call earlier today. So there's lots of experimentation and there's a bit of a movement, but I do think there will be a power struggle. You know, there is a power struggle underneath all of that, right? Like there's a lot of talk right now. It's got more momentum than it used to have, but there's a need for continuing to demand from philanthropy that it do this. And unless there is that demand, and honestly, like there's opportunities to change how philanthropy is regulated that could strengthen that demand too. So there's a government role in this as well. And the fact that, actually, I don't know who on the phone has thought about this even more than me. Some of this was in the webinar you went to last week, Eve. Did that, or I guess this week. Am I talking the same language, or were they on a different wavelength?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've been part of lots of conversations around this. I mean, I think it's always, there's a few people in these organizations that are interested in these conversations, and then their role is to take it home and sort of continue the conversation internally. And I am not one of our big decision makers, but at the same time, as a grant maker, I do have a certain amount of decision making power, and I try to reflect on that, but I also try then to take it home. But yeah, it takes time then as well to spread these messages. Yeah.
I just want to add, and it's a bit of a story / thought, and then a question that leads to it, because there have been efforts for a long time, to change sort of results models and reporting to be more locally led, even with some of the global funds, including the pilot program for climate resilience, $1.2 billion program, US program in 23 countries that spent over a decade trying to hybridize both national priorities with local priorities, and have the flexibility for reporting out based on what's considered country driven and country led at each level. And it really, I'd say, didn't work very well over time. It still became, even if it was customized, really became a check the box reporting requirement, and even reinvented a few times, just I still think is a burden. I wouldn't say that's the model, but I'm also concerned about ones where it's only left to sort of the local community to self-identify and report back out based on those terms alone, because I don't realistically think that will cut it for a lot of the international funders, and people wondering not only if their money is being well spent, but whether they're investing in the most strategic or most influential places or communities, and whether or not that precious money, which is a scarce resource, should be invested somewhere else, and it becomes a bit of a competition. I don't know if anybody sees an inherent competition for results, an inherent competition for resources. I personally don't see an answer to this, and I'm not trying to be all negative, but I would love to see additional solutions to the conundrum of how to put that trust and faith and share those risks, the themes that have been coming forward, and rightfully so, with this need for at least donors to really demonstrate that they're putting their money in a place that's really, truly impactful and speaks on its own accord.
Yeah.
I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah, really, just to follow up on what Anna is saying, I think this similar conversation going on, particularly dealing with what we call institutional donors like EU and others, particularly in the space of climate change and even humanitarian response. There is a gaining momentum about localization.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, which is basically a need to push and shift the power so that we have more of the communities that are impacted leading the role when it comes to responding to their needs. But as you've correctly observed, is that there is a lot of inertia to effect that. For example, if you read the World Humanitarian Summit outcome of 2016, where the UN even committed as well on localization, they came up with big terms like the Grand Bargain commitments and stuff like that. 6 or 5 years down the line, very little has been achieved when it comes to aspect of localization. Even big institutional donors have not really translated that into reality, given what they have been doing over and over again. But for sure, it is a conversation that is going on, that when we put the communities at the center, things work better, even with very modest and moderate funding. That's the reality. For example, I work in a developing country. We have been, for example, Christian Aid has been receiving funding from, say, CJRF, and even institutional donors like, say, FCD or DFID, formerly DFID. You will find that, for example, DFID extends the same funding to NGOs like Christian Aid and to World Bank and other UN agencies. But you find the kind of reporting requirements that they put on NGOs is even more thorough and actually bordering on certain level of burdensome. But when you check on the other side, what they give, the same funding, same kitty to World Bank and maybe UNDP, there are no such rigorous reporting requirements. So you ask yourself, then of course, these guys end up spending a lot of money at the national level, perhaps because I think at the end of the day, you come to realize that actually the focus is basically really to kind of strengthen government relationship. They are not so much concerned about communities and the empowerment and the aspects of coming out of poverty. Otherwise, why would they be having this kind of differential treatment to institutions like the World Bank, yeah, and the UNDP and others? But they have got very strict kind of requirements for example, local communities or local institutions. They cannot even meet the bar in terms of receiving funding from them, not at all. Because when you look at the requirements, then it's like, for sure, they can't. So that's the reality. So this conversation really need to go on. And I would imagine that foundations and philanthropies could really help to catalyze that actually local communities and their local institutions can be trusted, yeah, with resources, and they can manage them better to build their resilience to climate change. Thanks.
Well, we had this scheduled for half an hour, and I think we'd all agree that this could be a week-long retreat workshop, and amazing things would happen. But amazing things have also happened today, so I'm really grateful, and I know we're going to be pulling together some of the things, everything that was shared today, but try to synthesize things in some messages and examples that can be amplified back out, that you all can take to your own work and organizations, but that will also resonate with a broader group. Really grateful for those who have been chiming in, and the planning group who will help to shepherd that. Yeah. Heather, is there anything else you'd like to share?
Thanks, everyone. I'm really delighted you wanted to keep talking and stuck with us this long. I know it's supper time for some and lunchtime for others, and breakfast still for a couple folks. So good to see all your faces, and hopefully we'll be together in person soon.
Thanks for organizing a great group, Heather. Really appreciate it.
Thanks. Great to
Thank
see you
you.
all. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you so
Thanks,
much.
everybody.
Bye, everybody.